All right, let's move on to part 3. Before we go, are there any more questions about part 2, A or B? Okay. I'll move on then. So part 3 contains almost all of the forms and logs, as well as a complete instructions guide for how to use all of them. The forms and logs in this section are for monitoring to ensure that safe food handling procedures and prerequisite program standards are being met. Part 3 contains the following monitoring forms that must be completed accordingly. They're going to be daily forms, weekly forms, monthly forms, and as needed forms. So new this year, we have updated this section to include a placeholder for your environmental health inspections to be filed if they're not kept electronically. It's not required that you store them there. It's just a place to remember to include them in your HACCP book. If they're not stored here, you'll need to indicate where you're going to store them in the as needed monitoring forms summary page in this section. Another thing I want to note about the Part 3 monitoring forms is that not all kitchens are going to need to complete all the forms depending on your operation and equipment. Feel free to contact your school nutrition consultant if you have any questions on which forms you should use. But I'll just give a quick example. If you are smaller operation and let's say you don't use a milk box, then you don't need to complete the milk box form. But there are certain ones that you'll most likely use on a day-to-day basis, such as the hand sink form and the kitchen assessment form. Pretty much everyone will need to use those as an example. Okay. I want to make a note about the monitoring logs instructions file. This has probably been the most overlooked document in the past year. Previously, we had instructions for each log provided with that log itself. It was usually the first several pages were the instructions, and then you would get to the actual log template. But we moved the instructions into a single file to condense the information and help you all save on printing costs because it was a lot of repetition. But we're finding that I'm not sure that everybody is reading the instructions. So the shortened instructions or notes are included on a lot of the actual logs themselves, but they don't always provide a complete picture as to how the log should be completed. So my advice here is please read the instructions before completing the log or providing training on how to complete it. It should answer most of the questions that you might have. Please don't rely just on the footnotes and the shortened instructions on the log itself. They're kind of there for a quick reminder, but really, please read the instructions file first because that should provide you much more detail. Here's the longer list of all the forms, the monitoring logs and forms we have. Again, I'm not going to read over all of this, but I'm going to go over a few of these forms that we've had a lot of questions about. And I know that someone asked about cooling. We'll go over the cooling as well as part of this. All right, the first one I want to briefly review is the kitchen assessment. So there's a few key takeaways for this log. First, if you don't have the equipment listed on the log, you can either leave that part blank or put NA, such as if you don't have a dish machine, then you wouldn't need to fill out any of those parts. Second, please use the correct units. Often we see a number put in, but it's unclear whether it's, for example, a temperature or a concentration. So just make sure that you're including the correct units when you include a number. And a good example of this is the dish machine sanitizing. Are you using heat sanitizing, so temperature for your final rinse, or are you using a concentration, would be the parts per million or ppm. For the split column, the one that says dish, sink, wash, and sanitizing setup, the left triangle is for the wash step, and the right triangle is for the sanitizing step. So for example, the left should only be a temperature for the wash water temperature, but the right triangle could be a temperature if you're doing high heat sanitizing, or it could be a ppm for chemical sanitizing. . The next log I want to go over is the hand sink assessment. There's no need to measure the water temperature every day. The instructions state, occasionally use a metallic stem thermometer to measure the temperature of the water so you know what warm water feels like. Afterward, you can simply feel the water if it's warm rather than measuring the actual temperature. If warm water is available, mark Y. If no, mark N. For the upcoming school year, we've updated the language in the log to clarify these instructions, and you'll see that highlighted here in yellow. Okay, now I want to review the cooling log. The USDA guidance for school food authorities developing a school food safety program based on the process approach to HACCP principles is that guidance I referred to from 2006. This states that schools must maintain records of cooking, cooling, and reheating temperatures and other critical control points in the food preparation process. This year, we had several questions about using this log correctly. First, I want to review how to complete this log. For each day, if cooked or heated TCS foods are being cooled, record the date and the product name. For each product, you'll want to take the temperature when you begin cooling and record that time and temperature. For example, when you're taking the food out of hot holding. The person taking the temperature and recording the temperature and time must initial here. Then you'll want to take the temperature again and record the time later in the cooling process based on the 1 or 2 stage method you are using. The manager must initial after the second time temperature is noted. If there is a corrective action or corrective actions, it will need to be recorded in the corrective actions section. Corrective actions can include if a food does not reach the desired temperature range within the specified amount of time as outlined by the 1 or 2 stage cooling process. It has come to our attention that there are some situations during the cooling process that may not be clear from our HACCP plan reference material and cooling log. As you remember, cooling TCS foods can happen in 2 different ways. This is that 1 or 2 stage process I just referred to. The first is cooling from 135 degrees Fahrenheit or above to 41 degrees Fahrenheit or below within 4 hours. This is the 1 stage. Or the 2-stage process, which is cooling from 135 degrees Fahrenheit or above to 70 degrees Fahrenheit or below within 2 hours, and in conjunction then cooling from 70 degrees Fahrenheit or below to 41 degrees Fahrenheit or below within another 4 hours. This second option, as I said, is called the 2-stage cooling. For scheduling reasons, either due to the timing or duration of lunch service and/or staff schedules, the situation may occur where you don't have 2 hours from the start of the cooling process until the last staff person must leave for the day. In this situation, out of an abundance of caution, we are instructing that any TCS food being cooled that does not reach 70 or below by the time staff must leave, if this is less than 2 hours, this food must be discarded. The reason we're doing this and asking this is because we do not have sufficient data to demonstrate that food in this situation would consistently reach 70 degrees Fahrenheit or below within 2 hours if it had not already reached that temperature range prior to the 2-hour mark. I'm going to read that again because I know that this is important for many of you out there. So for scheduling reasons, either due to the timing or duration of lunch service and/or staff schedules, the situation may occur where you don't have 2 hours from the start of the cooling process until the last staff person must leave for the day. In this situation, out of an abundance of caution, we are instructing that any TCS food being cooled that does not reach 70 degrees Fahrenheit or below by the time staff must leave for the day, if that's less than 2 hours, must be discarded. We do not have sufficient data to demonstrate that food in this situation would consistently reach 70 degrees Fahrenheit or below within 2 hours if it had not already reached that temperature range prior to the 2-hour mark. If you have worked with your local health department and have sufficient data to support that it would reach a safe temperature range, then we are happy to, go with their advice and their procedures on that. So, again, if this is something that is important to you, please work with your local health department. We do ask you keep us in the loop, just so we are aware that you're working with them to be able to show more consistency there. Again, if utilizing cooled foods is a priority and you fall into this situation, another recommendation is to adapt your cooling processes as much as possible so you can cool them down more quickly and get to that 70 degrees Fahrenheit or below by the time staff need to leave. You could explore options such as, ice paddles or, redistributing food into, smaller shallow containers to help facilitate the cooling process more quickly. So explore the options you have to continue to safely cool and utilize any leftovers or pre-prepared foods. I know this is not an ideal situation for many of you and that these updated instructions may cause changes to your operation. Please know that we are erring on the side of caution to prevent any potential foodborne illness outbreaks from happening in your kitchens. Part 3, I'd like to share a few tips for completing the monitoring log successfully. Again, I've said this before, but please read the instructions file before completing a log for the first time and before providing any training to others on completing the log. This will help make sure it's being completed accurately and consistently across your team. Make sure to write the month and year at the top of the log in the space provided, with the exception of the cooling log because there's no space there. This is important for our documentation. We want to make sure that the temperature is on there. We can say, this is from this month and this year. Also, please include the units of measure. We've kind of said this before, but making sure that you're putting the right unit there so we know what the number is and what it means. If you have multiple pieces of the same type of equipment, for example, you have several hot boxes or reach-in coolers in your kitchen, make sure that you indicate which log is for which piece of equipment because you're going to have several copies of the same log, one for each piece of equipment. You could designate each one with a number, a letter, or a color. For example, reach-in 1 or hot box A. It may be best to avoid putting a location as the indicator, such as reach in by office, just in case it's too vague or you happen to move the equipment to a new location. It's also a good idea to keep blank copies of the log for each equipment or purpose on hand for quickly transitioning to the next month, or if something happens to an existing log and it needs to be replaced. We also recommend organizing the logs in a way that best meets the needs of your school or district. Some examples could be keeping logs for each type of equipment in a sheet protector that's taped to that piece of equipment, or putting all logs together in a binder or notebook that is kept in the manager's office, or you could use some other method. Are there any other questions about part 3 before we move on to part 4? Okay. And again, we'll have time for questions at the very end too. So part 4 of the HACCP plan is dedicated to understanding and documenting the required continuing education in the area of food safety. This is also where employees must review and sign the Employee Health Policy Agreement and Employee Food Safety Checklist each year. It is important to note that while it is not required that documentation of completed food safety continuing education is filed in this section, it does need to be available for review whenever requested, such as by an NCDPI staff member, on a TA or AR, or by your local health inspector. You could also file this information with your other professional standards documentation. Part 4 contains continuing education and professional development training documents for employees. So the first is the Employee Health Policy Agreement, and then you'll also see the Food Safety Checklist for employees. Both of these must be completed each year for each employee. I know this is different from how it's been done in the past, but about a year or two ago, we switched this, and I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. So these two documents need to be completed new each year for each employee. So not just when they're hired. If it's not kept with your HACCP notebook, we do recommend keeping documentation of your food safety and HACCP continuing education with your professional standards documentation, which I already said. Copies of the signed employee health policy agreements and food safety checklists, as well as food safety and HACCP continuing education reports, should you use them, and allergen awareness training for servers and cashiers should also be kept in part 4. Can we file pest control reports from our pest control company behind week 4 pest control monitoring form? Absolutely. You may also utilize them for your operation assessment. I think there's a section in there that also asks for pest control information. There are several forms for Part 4. We've already mentioned some of these, but there are both English and Spanish versions of the Health Policy Agreement and the Food Safety Checklist for employees. The Health Policy Agreement form, that is the one that your local health inspector will look for, and we'll go into more detail on that form in a few slides. There's also an Employee Health Policy Agreement template that includes the Health Policy Agreement form, as we just mentioned, with a longer explanation of the policy. And this is available should you wish to adopt the complete policy for your school or district. Again, I said the food safety checklist is also available in English and Spanish. The HACCP, Food Safety and HACCP Continuing Education Report form can be used as a template to record completed hours of food safety and HACCP-related continuing education. If you would like to use it, it's not required, but it should be kept as part of the HACCP plan template if you choose to use it. A substitute employee list template is also available, and this helps identify not only your regular substitutes, if you have any, I know you're all struggling with that, but also making sure that they've completed the necessary food safety forms. So it has a place for the person's name and then also to indicate if they've completed the appropriate health policy agreement and food safety checklist forms. According to the Food Code, each food establishment must have a written employee health policy agreement to ensure employees or conditional employees notify the person in charge when they experience any of the symptoms, diagnosis, and exposures that are transmissible through food so that the person in charge can take appropriate steps to prevent the transmission of foodborne illness. That's why we have the health policy agreement form. That policy agreement form document explains which symptoms and illnesses employees must report and is also a tool to help the PIC comply with the requirements outlined by the North Carolina Food Code. Even though the incidence of foodborne illness in school nutrition programs is low because y'all do such a fantastic job, there are still risks. Foodborne illness prevention begins with properly trained staff not working when they are sick with vomiting, diarrhea, sore throat with fever or jaundice, or if they've been diagnosed with a reportable communicable disease. The PIC should continue to promote and reinforce awareness of this policy to all food employees on a regular basis to ensure compliance. The PIC should train employees annually on the employee health policy and ensure that each food handler signs a new copy every year. Please keep signed copies of the employee health policy agreements on file. Each of our North Carolina HACCP plan templates includes a copy of the policy agreement, both in English and Spanish. You may also contact your school nutrition consultant for a sample employee health policy agreement. Let's briefly review what the person in charge or PIC must do if an employee shows signs of any symptoms listed on the slide. If any employees show signs of these symptoms, they need to be sent home immediately because they can contaminate food and cause a foodborne illness. Documentation such as the employee illness log must be completed when employees are sent home. Having this documentation is extremely important, especially if a foodborne illness outbreak does occur. Keep in mind that diarrhea and vomiting from non-infectious conditions do not apply to this policy. However, a physician should make the diagnosis of the non-infectious condition, and the employee should provide written documentation to the PIC that indicates the condition is non-infectious. The employee must report exposure to or diagnosis of any of the following foodborne pathogens. We call these the big six: norovirus, hepatitis A virus, Salmonella typhi, Shigella, E. coli, and non-typhoidal salmonella. These pathogens are identified as being highly infectious and are easily transmitted to food by sick employees. According to the Food Code, it is the responsibility of the PIC to report these to the health department when an employee is diagnosed with one of the big six illnesses shown on this slide. We recognize that school nutrition program food establishments are often a little different than a traditional food establishment in terms of the chain of command. We are advising that school nutrition managers or the PIC of a school kitchen communicate any of these required illnesses or exposures to their school nutrition administrator. Continuing education and training is an important part of your HACCP plan. Educational opportunities should be specific to the operation. It should include an overview of the safe food handling procedures, the prerequisite programs, how the standards will be monitored, and on what form observations are to be recorded. Different amounts and types of training are required for you and your kitchen staff. As managers and the person in charge of the kitchen, they must hold a certified food protection manager certification, which we'll talk about in more detail shortly. And all staff must receive at least 4 hours of food safety continuing education every 3 to 5 years. Generally, this can include any 15-minute or longer food safety trainings, whether in person or online, such as your back-to-school training on food safety, a manager meeting that covers food safety, any online modules, or even preparation course for taking or recertifying your Certified Food Protection Manager certification. Temporary staff, substitutes, and volunteers who handle food should receive food safety training to provide at least a basic or targeted food safety training relevant to the job duties being performed. It is also recommended to provide hazard communications and pesticide or pest management continuing education as it is relevant to your employee job duties. Continuing education and training is an important part of your HACCP plan. Educational opportunities should be specific to the operation. It should also include an overview of the safe food handling procedures, the prerequisite programs, how the standards will be monitored, and on what forms observations are to be recorded. There are several continuing education resources, including the Safe Plates for School Nutrition Staff course to teach HACCP to school nutrition staff. So Safe Plates for School Nutrition Staff used to be what you might know as HACCP in your schools. They rebranded the program, but it's essentially the same course. This is a 6-module course that provides 4 hours of professional development. There are 4 additional modules in the course that can be completed for a total of 8 hours of instruction. This course has been approved by the School Nutrition Association for Food Safety Core course for their certification program. Completing the entire 8 hours of instruction will provide the required credit for food safety. These resources are available on our website. You may also contact your local cooperative extension office for more information about Safe Plates training for the Certified Food Protection Manager exam. Another option that's well known is the Food Safety in Schools curriculum, or called Serving It Safe, was how it used to be called. This is through the Institute of Child Nutrition. It is an instructor-led course that is downloadable from their website and provides 6 lessons in basic food safety. One more option that we do have available is the No Time to Teach or No Time to Train series, which is a series of 13 short lessons that are 15 minutes each. And again, these are also instructor-led. We do have these available on our website in the HACCP food safety section. They are probably in need of some updating, so we are in the process of updating those for the next school year, but that is another option if you have limited time to train your staff. Another important area that should be covered is allergens. All school nutrition employees serving on the line or operating the point of service system, such as a cash register or checking a roster, must be properly taught in food allergen awareness as it relates to their assigned duties of serving customers. In other words, knowing proper responses to questions about allergens in food served. Allergen awareness training is required annually. Also refer to Part 1 of the HACCP plan under prerequisite programs and Part 4 of the HACCP plan for more information about this requirement. You can use a variety of sources to meet the requirement for allergen training. Safe Plates for School Nutrition Staff has a bonus module on allergens. The Institute of Child Nutrition also has a variety of allergen training resources. The Food Allergen Research and Education Organization, FARE, also has a lot of resources on allergen awareness and training. Since allergen awareness education and demonstration of knowledge is now part of the North Carolina Food Code, you may be asked by your local health inspector for documentation around allergen awareness and training. We recommend keeping this documentation either in your HACCP plan notebook under Part 4 or with your professional standards documentation. As we said earlier, the North Carolina Food Code also requires a person in charge who has obtained a Certified Food Protection Manager certificate to be present at any time the food establishment is open for business. It is recommended that at least 2 people in each school kitchen have this certification so that you can stay in compliance with the code. 2 points could be deducted from your inspection grade for noncompliance during an inspection. I was at a school site one time and there was only one person with that certification and they needed to leave to go to make a deposit. And I told them they couldn't do that because then they would not have a person in charge because it was during operations and meal service. So having a second person is an excellent idea in case one person needs to step out or is not, is sick and not able to come that day. So we highly recommend having 2 people. All Certified Food Protection Manager exams must be approved by the American National Standards Institute. Approved exams are currently offered by the following organizations listed here: Prometrics, National Registry of Food Safety Professionals. The Safe Plates course used to use this one. They've previously also used Prometrics to administer the exam, but again, those 2 organizations are on that list. 360training.com Incorporated, National Restaurant Association Educational Foundation. I believe this is the one that administers the ServSafe exam. And then stateFoodSafety.com is another option. The North Carolina Food Code does not require taking a preparation course, but it does require passing the exam. If you've never taken the exam before, we strongly recommend that you take a preparation course because it does increase the rate of successful passing. All right, last but not least, Part 5 is next. Do we have any questions about Part 4 before we continue on to Part 5? Okay. Part 5 is the last section of the commercial HACCP plan template. It's where information about menus and recipes is stored for the purposes of showing that potential food safety hazards are being properly controlled during production and for showing the schedule of when different menu items are being provided. Part 5 is the menus and the recipes section. The menu summary form, and we'll talk about the forms on the next few slides, is optional if all of your recipes are standardized in the report and they report the HACCP process information on them. So the menu summary form is just a way of collecting this information before most of us transition to more of an electronic system of recipes. Part 5 should also contain copies of each month's menu or cycle menus, as well as lists of pre-prepared foods and time as a public health control procedures if you're using time as a public health control. Please note that we had information about TCS foods in Part 5, which has been moved to Part 1 because it's more of a reference material. I want to talk a little bit about HACCP process. So what is a HACCP process? It is determined by the number of times a menu item passes through the temperature danger zone of between 41 degrees Fahrenheit and 135 degrees Fahrenheit before it is served. So that's how they've determined these HACCP process categories. Information is provided in Part 1 of the HACCP plan templates to help determine, is also in Part 5, the correct HACCP process for the menu summary. These are the different processes listed here on the slide. Process category 1 is actually not a process at all, really. That's the foods that are, process 4 is the one that's not really a process at all. That is for non-TCS foods, so there's no HACCP process. But category 1 is for TCS foods that are not cooked. Process category 2 is TCS foods that are heated and served the same day. Process category 3 are TCS foods that are considered more complex in food preparation. And those are ones that are going to be, heated and then cooled and then reserved on a different day. And we'll talk more about what we mean by that in a couple slides. I also want to talk about time as a public health control. So time as a public health control, which we call TPHC, is a critical control point that can be used when hot or cold food, cold holding is not feasible. So when you're using TPHC, limit the amount of time the foods are between 41 degrees Fahrenheit and 135 degrees Fahrenheit to avoid the growth of harmful bacteria. That's the purpose of TPHC. So foods that are held this way do require written procedures that are filed in the HACCP plan, and you should be limiting that time to 4 hours or less. Essentially, TPH foods are menu items that are using time without temperature control as that public health control. So you're utilizing that time window instead of measuring a temperature and monitoring temperatures. TPHC procedures are especially effective for foods that are served in innovative or alternate service areas, such as your classroom, hallways, buses, or field trips. That's why we have that part in Part 2A that's asking about your service locations, and a reminder that if you use TPHC to put the procedures here in Part 5. They're also useful for fast-moving items where your temperature control may be hard to maintain. So something like a chicken nugget or chicken tender, burgers, sandwiches, fries, packaged salads, those types of foods. When using TPHC, the food will need to be cooked or prepared and served. Ready-to-eat food served at any temperature or food discarded within 4 hours from the point in time when the food is removed from temperature control. All menu items that are subject to TPHC must be handled in accordance with the written procedure that complies with safe food handling requirements in the food establishment. So that's, using TPHC rather than temperature. This is outlined in Section 3 of the North Carolina Food Code. So again, these procedures do need to be written according to the food code. They don't have to be pre-approved by your local health inspector, but you do want them to comply with all of the criteria in that food code section. And we do explain that in our guidance on writing TPHC procedures. TPHC only applies to food products and procedures that are described in the written procedures. So any changes you make from those written procedures are going to avoid the safety measures of using TPHC. So essentially, you want to write specific procedures and follow them as written. A recommended TPHC form is included in the Part 5 form section, which we'll go over in a minute. And there is a sample that's been completed in Part 1 to help guide you. You're not required to use the form, but again, it will help you make sure that all of the required information per the food code is listed. Okay, here are the forms again. We've talked about the menu summary, but as I said again, it's optional and it is used for listing out each recipe by HACCP process category. Not many use this anymore since most of us have transitioned to electronic databases for storing your recipes. The pre-prepared food list is a log for indicating any foods that meet our definition of pre-prepared, which we'll talk about next. This definition is explained a bit further in Part 5, but really it distinguishes pre-prepared from leftover in terms of what's required for safe handling for these types of foods. There's also a signature and date line on this form, so that provides accountability for understanding those safe food handling requirements for pre-prepared foods. The time as a public health control foods template, we just talked about that one. That provides the instructions, and you can also find sample TPHC procedures in part 1, but it does provide the instructions and the blank template. The time as a public health control delivery log is for providing information related to the delivery of TPHC food items that are transported from a location where they are prepared to a different location where they are served. This allows for tracking of time to show that TPHC procedures are being followed and no more than 4 hours has passed from when a food left a safe temperature control until it is delivered. Okay, so this slide reviews the difference between what we mean as leftover and what we mean as pre-prepared. I know this gets a bit complicated, so I wanted to make sure that I went over this. So 2 common causes of foodborne illness are time and temperature abuse, as we know, due to preparing food too far in advance of service, so not holding it properly at the proper temperatures, and also improperly cooling TCS foods. So that's why we've made this distinction here. Some schools prepare foods in advance because it's economical, and we call these pre-prepared foods. Many schools also save leftovers, which must be properly cooled and used within 72 hours. But there's a big difference between pre-prepared foods and leftovers in terms of food safety. All menu items can be leftovers, but not all menu items are pre-prepared. Therefore, the first step is to identify which menu items you typically pre-prepare based on the following definitions. Pre-prepared foods are menu items or menu ingredients that are prepared in advance for future service beyond a specific meal. So these items are foods that are cooked or prepared in-house, properly chilled immediately after preparation, so they're not being held for service. Then they are packaged and labeled and frozen for future use. Examples could be browned ground beef, spaghetti sauce, chili, certain breads. These pre-prepared items have a frozen shelf life of 4 weeks. This does not include your commercially processed pre-prepared foods such as hamburger patties, breaded or grilled chicken patties, pizza, etc. That would be different though if you were purchasing, the raw product, making your own patties and then freezing them. That, if you were heating them up and then doing that, that would be different. For commercially processed frozen foods, follow your manufacturer's guidelines for storage there. Leftovers, on the other hand, are menu items that are prepared and held for a specific day's menu and are not served. So an example here would be, a pan of soup that is held in a hot holding cabinet and pre-made entree salads or sandwich wraps that are held in a cooler. Leftover menu items have a refrigerated or frozen shelf life of 72 hours only if the final temperature of the item at the end of the serving time is within the allowable safe temperature range, and if the items are from an employee-monitored serving line. Please note that the shelf life is shorter than allowed by the food code because North Carolina school nutrition programs hold to very high food safety standards when we're serving leftovers, and this is to reduce the risk of foodborne illness. Also, make sure that you're labeling leftover and pre-prepared foods appropriately, with the name of the item, the date they're prepared, or the date to use, some way to, track that shelf life. A few quick housekeeping things in general about our HACCP plan templates that I wanted to share with you to help you in your journey to HACCP plan transcendence. Please use the most current version. Most pages have a date of last update, so please check to make sure that you're using the most current version. They're typically updated in late spring or early summer. For example, the templates for the next school year, that's school year 2024-2025, will have April, May, June, or July of 2024 written on them. These are the ones that or the ones you have been using this year will have April, May, or June of 2023 in them. So that's for the 23-24 or the, current now ended school year. It's important to use the most current version each year for all of the pages because we make updates each year for a variety of reasons, but sometimes for important food code or other regulatory changes. So I strongly encourage you to reprint or re-download everything. Don't just reprint certain sections. Make sure you're taking the incomplete files each year and using those. Your school food authority may choose to keep some of the parts of the HACCP plan electronic. This is completely fine as long as the following are still met. All of the information is completed and the original copies are retained per your record storage requirements. So that's 3 years plus the current year or a more strict retention requirement that you have locally. Secondly, that managers, staff, and others who are handling the food know where and how to access the information. Each section and all of the forms come with some type of instructions. As I've said several times already, please read the instructions. Most of the forms have a few notes on the form itself, but additional instructions are always helpful to read and are a reference, are also in the reference section of that part of the HACCP plan template. And I forgot to address the last thing on there. If you aren't sure, ask. It's always better to get clarification. So please do not hesitate to reach out to me or your school nutrition consultant if you have any questions at all about your HACCP plan template. In addition to correcting a few minor grammar and spelling issues, I wanted to note some of the updates for the coming year's commercial HACCP plan template. The key updates that will impact you include updated language related to the cooling practices, which we discussed. This is probably the most important update for those of you who heat and cool foods for later service. We will probably, or excuse me, we have, this is one of our webinars in this series, so we will review these and other updates as part of this. Another key update is we've added a placeholder in Part 3 for those health inspections. So if you're not keeping them electronically or in another location, please file your health inspection reports in Part 3. There is a instructions document for the placeholder page in more detail about that. We already went over this, but we've updated the hand sink assessment footnote to make it more clear about what is expected when you're assessing the water temperature. Again, more detailed instructions are provided in Part 3 in the instructions file, but essentially you don't need to actually measure the temperature each time unless it's your local procedure to do so. We've clarified the food safety checklist for employees, how often that needs to be completed. So we wanted to make that clear that it needs to be done each year for all food handlers, even if they are not new for that school year. It's also an important refresher that can be done as part of your back to school training. We've also added a place in Part 5 to indicate if your recipes are kept electronically, since we know many of you, probably most of you now, use electronic software for storing your recipes. If you have any questions about these or other updates, please do not hesitate to ask or reach out to me. All right, I also wanted to include this since I know many of us are very compliance focused, which is great, and you always want to do well on your ARs and your TAs. But here's a couple great ways to avoid HACCP findings. With the help from your central office, put together a new HACCP book or folder each school year. You may not need to print everything, or you may choose to not print everything, but please make sure to download it, the new copy each year, and use it for that school year. Do also keep the old versions on file. As we've said, 3 years plus the current year or a more strict local record retention policy. Make sure all areas of the HACCP plan template are completed annually, such as Part 2A, 2B, Part 3 monitoring logs, etc. As we've said already, Part 2B, that's Part 2A, only needs to be revised as information changes. But please do keep that original version and make a copy so you don't lose that original information. I was on a TA once where they were marking out information on the original and updating it there from the previous year. Please try not to do that. Just make sure that you make a copy of it first so that we can keep that original record as part of our record retention requirements. Also keep in mind that all school food authorities should fully complete the HACCP plan templates with all required information and follow the procedures to have a fully functioning HACCP plan in place. To make sure that areas needing to be completed are done correctly, please make sure to read and follow the instructions for completing each section or log. Note and follow any local procedures that are more strict, as I've mentioned. If you have any questions about how to complete a log correctly, you can contact myself or your school nutrition consultant. Keep copies of your latest food establishment inspections on file. You should make sure you're receiving these from your local health inspector. I know many of you keep them at the central office, but if you're able to send copies to the sites as well, I know that does help the reviewers when they come in and look for them. You will need to have at least 2 different inspection reports for each school year by the end of that year. And if you only have received one close to the end of the school year, please contact your school nutrition or please contact your health department and let them know that you need another one. This is for those who receive somewhat quarterly inspections. If you are a regional facility and you only receive 1 or 2 each year, we are aware of that and understand that policy. But if you're not getting at least 2, please let us know and contact your local health inspector. Also make sure that the most recent score is posted in a location visible to the public, such as in the cafeteria or eating area. That's also one of our requirements. Make sure that your Certified Food Protection Manager certificate certification stays current. And that's for you and your staff. They are good for 5 years and should have an issue and or expiration date on them. There's several organizations that we talked about that provide opportunities to get this certification. ServeSafe and the Safe Plates program are 2 examples of those that help provide instruction in the exam. Another good suggestion is to keep a spreadsheet or chart of all of those different employees that have the certification or need it, and to track the dates that way so that you can quickly identify who's up for recertification every year and work to get those employees recertified as needed. Because we want to avoid any lapse in certification, when a health inspector comes in for a visit. Last and most importantly, follow safe food handling practices. Make sure you're handling food safely as it's described in Part 1 of your HACCP plan, that prerequisite programs and safe food handling procedures sections. If you have questions, please use that Part 1 to help answer them. That's why it's there. It's there to help you. If you still aren't sure, again, please feel free to contact me or your school nutrition consultant. Keeping good records and logs is so important to support that you and your staff handled food safely, especially in the event that someone gets sick and thinks that your school nutrition program or kitchen may be to blame. We definitely don't want that, and it helps to have documentation to back up that you served and handled food safely. That brings us to the end of this webinar. Again, please refer to our website, or you're welcome to reach out to me directly or your school nutrition consultant if you have any questions about food safety or HACCP. Does anyone have any questions or want me to go over everything at this time? Please feel free to unmute yourself or type in the chat, and I will do my best to address your question. I am happy to send out these slides if I can figure out how to download our attendance list here. We will also, as I mentioned earlier, we are recording this session. So we will make that recording available to everyone once we are able to get it processed and ready to send out, or posted on the website, or both. So great question. Is the central office required to have a HACCP book on file? So this depends on your operation. If you're a school district, then typically you have a separate HACCP book for each school site. So you do not also need one at your central office. However, let's say maybe you're a smaller charter school and you only have one site. You may keep the HACCP book, at your central office, and your site are the same thing essentially. So it kind of depends on the operation. There is a question with the administrative review that asks if the food safety plan is site-based or district-wide. So there is a question there, but the short answer is if you are a school district, no, your central office does not need its own HACCP book. Although you may want to have, copies of the files downloaded for the reference in case one of your managers or someone asks you a question about it. You have the reference there as well. Okay. Well, if there are no further questions, let me make sure that, oops, I can make sure no one has a hand raised. John Hawthorne, did you still have a question or did I already address it? I think you had raised your hand a while ago. Okay, awesome. Great. Well, thank you all so much. Oh, one more. HACCP in your school used to be required every so often is Safe Plates required. So that program and the Safe Plates for school nutrition staff was more or less designed to help meet that requirement for every 3 to 5 years. So the history there is that it has been historically an in-person training, but now it is also available online. There is information in our continuing education and professional development section for the school Safe Plates for School Nutrition Staff online course and how to access it. So it can help you meet that 4 hours every 3 to 5 years requirement because the core modules are providing 4 hours of continuing education credit there.